Hello and welcome to the Digital Publishing Podcast, Episode 12, The Art of the Probable. I'm Simon Mellins, and this time my co-host Simon Holt and I are talking all things AI and publishing with renowned industry expert George Walkley. All of the voices you are about to hear are human. And we're back! Welcome, George, and welcome back to my lovely co-host, Simon. Simon, are you excited to talk AI today?
Extremely.
Excellent. And how have you been?
Pretty well, I think. I've had various bits of travel, mainly to the United States. Had a very engaging conversation about accessibility and disability inclusion at the Council for Science Editors meeting. So apart from being slightly jet-lagged, I'm doing pretty well. How have you been?
Super. Yes, cracking. Thank you. It's a busy time at the moment. I suppose when's it not? I think it's about the time we allow our lovely guest out the dungeon. So, George, if you'd join us here, how are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm Simon. Simon, very nice to see you both, and thanks for having me.
It's take me back for a second when I hear Simon. I thought, am I being shouted at for something?
Not yet.
Give us time.
Okay, yeah, quite. So, George, I think probably quite a few people who are listening to this have probably heard of you before. Quite a few of them have probably listened to it because you're on it. So maybe you could tell us, for those who don't know, a little bit about Outside Context, your firm, and what it is that you do as an AI consultant.
So thank you very much. So Outside Context is the name that I gave my company when I set up as a consultant in 2020. Because I was going to be employing other people and continue to, I felt it should be called something other than my own name. And really it sort of references two things. First of all, it's really a reference to the fact that in terms of problem solving, it's often very helpful to speak to somebody from outside the problem. Most of us find it easier to offer friends advice than to solve our own problems. And in the same way, getting someone from outside an organisation to come in and advise with a little bit of context and distance is very helpful, hence the name. The second part of this is that I'm a huge science fiction fan, and my favourite science fiction writer is the late Ian M. Banks, who wrote a wonderful novel called Accession. And in Accession, there is a concept called the outside context problem, which is the idea of a situation that's just so far away from what people understand that they struggle to deal with it. And in a sort of funny way, it reminded me about a lot of the conversations we had all had in digital media over the last 20 years as industries dealt with technology and change. So I stole it.
Wow. This makes me feel very dull for having just stuck my own name with a consulting limited at the end of it. That is brilliant. And how would you describe what you do? I realise that rather changes over time.
It's a sort of combination of things. I've become a great middle-aged cliche in having a portfolio career. So Outside Context, which is my consulting work, is probably 3 days out of every week. That includes working with clients in publishing, in technology, and as you've said, a great deal of that is to do with AI, as that's the topic that everyone's interested in at the moment. It also includes a couple of other things. So I'm a non-executive director of a scientific publisher called Burley Dodd Science Publishing, which is based just outside Cambridge. And I'm the chairman of the creative services group Midas, which includes a public relations company, a marketing services arm, and a small literary agency. So those other things sort of balance out what I do a bit.
Wow.
And could you tell us then a little bit how you got here? So, just a little bit about the kinds of things you've done during your career and how you've ended up in the AI space.
I think by accident is the honest answer to that.
So many people have answered that one.
Yeah, I mean, certainly books by accident, AI perhaps a little bit more by design. But, I came out of university, perhaps like a lot of people, without a very clear sense of what to do. I had quite a lot of pressure to, find a job, figure this out. I started working for my local bookshop, which was part of a small chain of, I think, about 15 stores the week that I joined. By the time I left 8 years later, it was over 150 stores. It had floated on the London Stock Exchange. I was working at their head office doing internet and intranet development, largely on the content side. And we were the subject of a hostile takeover by Waterstones, so it felt like it was time to move. I moved from there to the publishing side to what was then called Time Warner Books, which very quickly was taken over by Hachette and became Little Brown. I was at Little Brown 2005 to 2009, working my way up through roles in marketing and subsequently digital strategy. And then in 2009, digital was becoming a much bigger part of most publishers' lives. The Kindle was about to launch in the UK. We were all very focused back then on ebooks and rights clearances. And I was offered a role at Hachette's group management team, setting up the digital business in the UK, which I did until 2020. In my time there, I was responsible for ebooks, audiobooks. One of the most fun things I did was being the executive sponsor for recording studios within Hachette's headquarters in London, which was a great project to work on. Very reminiscent of this. Now I see all of us with headphones and microphones in front of us. And in the latter couple of years at Hachette, I'd been working as group development director, so looking at strategy, mergers and acquisitions, and some other areas. In 2020, with the pandemic, I had a bit of a change. I went freelance and set up my own business. And since then, I've worked with a range of clients, largely in publishing, but in some other industries as well. And AI had kind of been in the background to all of this for quite a long time. Back in 2013, 2014, ancient history, we were all very focused on a big tech player that had used people's copyright in a way that really upset them. Funny, nothing really changes, does it? In that case, it was Google Books, which had been scanning books in the world's libraries and making them available.
I remember it well.
That litigation, which I was only peripherally involved with, took, I think that the first 9 years of my time in publishing was taken up with that litigation.
Wow.
And in one of the meetings at the Publishers Association toward the end of it, there was a discussion about Google's long-term plans and where they were going with this. And I think it was Mark Bide, who was editor at the time, made a comment about the value of this as training data for large language models. And I was like, okay, training data, large language, what now? And Mark very kindly and patiently explained this to me. But it was this interesting thing that even back then there was this issue of, is this going to be used as training data for what we now understand to be an LLM? And so then when Bridget Shine at the IPG came and spoke to me in 2023 about developing some AI training, it was something that I'd been thinking about for a little while and it had been bubbling under.
Right. And I mean, it's amazing you've had this quite unique perspective on AI coming to it from publishing rather than people working in the tech space and in AI, then coming and seeing how to apply it to publishing afterwards. How does publishing differ in kind of the way that it approaches AI compared to other industries that you're familiar with?
Publishing is quite a special industry in many ways, and I think that it was actually very important to the IPG that their AI training come from someone with a publishing background. It'd be very easy to bring in a technologist who wouldn't really understand some of the points of detail. I've been around the business a while. There's plenty that I don't know, and certainly the detail of people's roles and is not something that I'm going to be familiar with across the board. But I kind of understand a bit about how the business operates. And an outsider would have had context, to go back to my original point, but they wouldn't necessarily have had that depth of knowledge. Publishing's really interesting, I think, because of the copyright point particularly. I think it was the New York Times the week before last that called training data the original sin of AI, the use of copyrighted material. But it means that any use of AI in publishing, however banal, is going to be bound up in that copyright conversation. If I look at other industries that I work with, so for example, I've got a lovely client in manufacturing industry. I've got some clients who work in other sectors, including things like aerospace. There are none of those restrictions. Nobody is focused on the copyright question. They're really just focused on efficacy. So on the one hand, publishing is sort of quite held back because of that. At the same time, there are restrictions in some of those other sectors that we don't have to deal with. If you look at, say, people working in the aerospace sector, there's perhaps a lot less freedom about which models they might be able to use. Experimenting with something like DeepSeek becomes much more problematic because of where that model's trained and where the data goes to. So they're not able to play around with it to the same extent. And I think publishing has a real advantage, which is that as an industry, we are people who tend to care about the written word. We are quite discerning consumers of what comes out of AI.
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to human in the loop review, we're quite good at looking at what comes out and not taking it at face value, but wanting something that's a bit better.
Right. Even if that means we lose some of the benefit of speed.
It's a balance, isn't it? I mean, I think at a very early stage of my career, someone told me that you can, for any given business problem, you can have any two out of good, cheap, and fast, but you can never have all three. So there is always some level of trade-off, and we see that. But actually, I think publishing has lots of opportunity with the technology, which we may get into as this conversation goes on.
Absolutely, and I think just building on one of the things you said there about good, cheap, and fast, I'd also say one of the things about AI for publishing is scale as well, right? You can, obviously, I work for Elsevier, who are, the largest scientific publisher. We publish, I think, 700,000 journal articles every year. So the idea that you might be able to systematically use AI for various things across a portfolio of that size, for example, is could be pretty transformational, I think. So just without wanting to put my own bias on this, I'd be interested to hear what you think are some of the main use cases for AI in the publishing space at the moment, and maybe what some of them might emerge to be in the future.
Sure, it's a really interesting question, and I guess the first thing we've got to do is define what we mean by publishing here. I think we can look at something like scientific publishing with the Elseviers at the top end of the scale. My colleagues like at Burley Dodds, who are a somewhat smaller business. I think for businesses like that, there's really interesting work that can be done around research, around discovery, around analytics. It's really interesting to see players like Elsevier, John Wiley, Oxford University Press with their partnership with, I think they're called Silverchair. There's some really interesting stuff being done around discoverability. And as a researcher, I think, like myself, I think that's really interesting and valuable. Within consumer publishing, it's a slightly different picture because it's less about a program of several 100,000 journal articles and more about a portfolio of 3,000 or 4,000 individual books, which aren't always as sort of heterogeneous. I mean, in that space, I think that there are really interesting things that can be done around ideation, around process, around content creation in some cases. So there's a really broad range of use cases that are out there. I think what's really interesting, though, is, to your point, Simon, when we see publishers actually getting involved in this, not just passively being a source of training data, authorized or unauthorized, but using AI in a strategic way.
So when it comes to that sort of use of AI, are you more focused on the kind of ideation and editorial side of things with kind of using AI to make content, or the production and distribution and marketing, the kind of post-writing part of things?
It depends entirely on the client, really. I mean, since September of 2023, I've worked with, I think, 268 or so publishers across training, consultancy, strategy work. And, there are some points of similarity between them, but each one is unique. They all have particular characteristics, and it's what's right for the client, not a one-size-fits-all approach to AI. I suppose I would really sort of break it down into sort of three buckets rather than your two. The first is certainly that sort of ideation creativity piece, which is sort of coming up with ideas. AI is very good at that. Not all ideas are equally good, but as human beings, we tend to be quite good at narrowing them down to something more manageable. There's certainly a sort of process operations back office side where AI can be really useful. The third area for me, though, is the really interesting one, which is about the actual finished product, whether that's a book, an ebook, an audiobook, a journal article, or something else. And I think that AI can help with that process in conceiving it, in planning it. I'm not sure we've yet seen an example of AI being particularly good at the actual writing. Um,
Yeah.
I get quite fed up when I hear people talk about AI writing because what most AI is doing is not writing as I recognize it. It's generating text following probabilistic patterns.
Hmm.
But writing as a process is an embodiment of thought. There's an element of care, there's an element of discovery that goes into that. And I think at the moment, at least, that's quite human. And I'm not seeing AI be able to do that to the same degree. So that third area is where I think most people are keen to protect the role of the human, and long may
Okay.
human creativity continue.
Yeah. How does that deficiency in AI manifest?
I think a friend of mine puts this really nicely that AI is about probability and human beings are about possibility.
Hmm.
An AI can replicate the vectors that it's seen before in a database. So, for instance, if I ask an AI to write a 1930s style golden age crime mystery with a locked room and was it the butler or the or Colonel Mustard, AI can do that because it's ingested everything that Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers ever wrote, and so it can come up with a perfectly adequate copy of that. If you think about a completely unique novel, think about something like James Joyce's Ulysses, which is not only new in terms of its characters and plot, but new in terms of its structure and form and function. I don't think an AI is capable of that kind of newness at the moment.
Hmm.
Yeah, I really like what you just said there about humans are about the art of the possible and
Mm.
AI is about the probable. That really resonates with me. Um, do you talked about different areas there, right? So the ideation area in the editorial space, the kind of process area in the production space, and you also talked about the kind of finished product and maybe things like remediation may be part of that.
Mm.
Um, do you see those as different specialisms where it comes to AI? And if so, do you have a particular specialism that relates to one of these, or do you feel that they're kind of more overlapping?
It's a cliched answer, but I'd see this almost like a Venn diagram, Simon. So, for example, think about something like, sort of creativity and ideation. Yes, that applies absolutely to an author or an editor. It also applies to a marketer. It applies to a publicist or a salesperson in terms of what they're doing, or parts of what they're doing at least. Similarly, some of the process stuff, may look like everyday work for a production director or someone in a back office function, digital
Mm-hmm.
production, let's say. But actually, again, there's some crossover with the marketing team that are producing a program of, TikTok videos or social posts or whatever it might be. They need to automate that process in the same way. And one of the things that I've definitely seen working with clients is it's really interesting to get people from different departments talking to one another. I just actually did a consulting process for an independent publisher, and it was really interesting. I spoke to, I think, 14 stakeholders from every part of that business over the course of 3 days. And it was really interesting at the end of it, looking back at my notes. I looked at rights, marketing, editorial, production, and sales. Every one of those departments had described exactly the same underlying use case, but with slightly different outputs and with a slightly different articulation of the
Hmm.
technology. Now, put those people in a room, and you suddenly realize that actually, yes, they could be sharing a model, they could be sharing best practice. There's actually a lot of, sorry, horrible word, synergy. There is a lot
Hmm.
of synergy there. So I think this is an interesting area because in smaller businesses, it tends to be quite possible to break that down and get people talking. It's in my very largest clients sometimes that are more highly structured that those conversations aren't as easy to start.
Right. And on that topic, is that gap between small and larger publishers, has AI got something to offer there? Do you think the gap between those in the future, even if there are differences in the way they might use AI, do you think AI has a propensity to actually narrow the gap in what they're able to do?
I think there's the potential for that, though I'm not certain that we've seen that yet. One of the big trends in AI development this year has been this idea of vibe coding, the idea that you don't need to be an
Mm,
expert coder, but that if you can prompt an AI model to describe the output or the effect you want to see, it will then write the code for you. And
yep.
there's this big debate about whether, startups need as many people. Interesting comparison. A friend of mine is in the information publishing business. He financial information has set up a business, and with a combination of himself and his knowledge, AI, and a small number of freelancers, he started a business. He's got a product, and he's now making money on it. He has done that on a far smaller scale than would have been the case historically. 10 years ago, to do a business like that, you would probably have needed a research team of, I don't know, let's say 5 to 10 people plus a development team. You're looking at probably 15 to 20 in total. You're looking at several million of startup capital. He's been able to do that on a far smaller scale. Now, this is a trend that we've seen in publishing already. If we look at publishing startups in, say, the 1980s, if I think of one of my bosses in publishing, Tim Healy-Hutchinson, who set up Headline in 1986, or Nigel Newton and Liz Calder setting up Bloomsbury in the same year, they needed to borrow quite a lot of money. It was quite a capital-intensive thing to do, and so relatively few people did it. Flash forward to the 2010s, 2020s, we see people setting up businesses like Bookouture, Storm, Hera, Canelo, which are proportionally much smaller when they start. They need much less capital, and so it's easier for people to get going. In the same way with AI, I think it's completely possible that we're going to see a 5 to 10 million pound publishing business that's perhaps one or two full-time employees
Hmm.
augmented by AI. And it's possible, I guess, that you could have a one-person business doing that. I differentiate, by the way, there from individual authors doing this as self-publishing, many of whom are
Right.
doing it very well. I'm talking about actually a publishing scale business with multiple
Yep.
authors and a bit of process in the background. And I think
Right.
it'll be really interesting to see what can happen there.
And which of the jobs do you think are the? I know no one wants to answer this really, but what type of roles do you think are the ones that would be under threat from that?
Well, okay, define again. I'm going to push back a little bit there, Simon, on
Sure.
your idea that there's a sort of threat there, because in fact, in a very small entrepreneurial business, it's not necessarily that there's a role at threat. It's that the CEO is trying to do absolutely everything. You are
Mm,
CEO, finance director, sales director, editorial director, chief human resources officer, bottle washer,
yeah.
office cleaner, and every other job there is. So AI is not taking a job away from someone who would have had it. It's allowing you to do it without taking someone on in the first place. So I think
Yeah.
it's slightly different. Now, long term, I think there's a really interesting question about what happens to employment. The Financial Times did a piece 3 weeks ago looking at employment in publishing. They were using US numbers from, I think, the Bureau for Labour Statistics. So this doesn't map exactly to the UK, but I'd expect a fairly similar pattern here. And what they saw is that actually, since the advent of AI, jobs in publishing had gone up. We don't
Mm,
always see that because there are other
yeah.
factors, there are economic factors that lead to layoffs or restructures or whatever.
Right.
But a lot of what is currently attributed to AI, I think, is really the economy or management decisions rather than
Right.
AI. Interestingly, the FT found that where jobs were relatively safe, it's where there's a lot of task variety. Think about the job of a production controller or a marketing manager. They're not just sitting at a computer all day doing tasks that an AI can automate. They've got to go into a progress meeting and report progress. They've got to talk to colleagues. They've got to negotiate with suppliers. Now, there's perhaps 20% of their role that the AI can help them with, and they'll be faster and more productive. But the AI isn't going to help with the rest. And if you're sort of saving, sort of perhaps half a day or a day of someone's week, you're not going to get rid of that role because you still need them the other 4 days a week. What's going to happen most likely is either their job is going to become perhaps a little bit more manageable than it was to start with, or alternatively, they're going to be doing something that they were never able to do before. And that
Mm,
enables some of the 0 to 1 use cases with AI, which I think are really interesting.
right. I mean, conceivably, it could just be fewer production controllers in that situation, right?
Well, but it's a trade off fewer production controllers, but more publishers. Because
Mm,
actually, if on the one hand AI is leading to fewer production controllers, but
yeah.
it's also lowering the barrier to entry for starting new
Right.
publishers, actually at that point, what happens here. If we look at some of the dynamics for the emergence of desktop publishing in the 1980s, I've seen numbers there that suggest that actually the universe of people in that area grew even as companies grew smaller because more people
Wow.
could start up.
Right. Organic growth.
Sure, sure. And so I find what you're saying here about starting up new publishers and smaller publishers fascinating. Obviously, as somebody who works for a large publisher and who has put quite a lot of emphasis on AI resourcing, to the extent that I don't think I'm overstretching it to say, there's definitely many people at the upper levels of Elsevier who see us as an information and analytics organization and a data company as opposed to kind of a traditional publisher. I wonder what your thoughts are about whether AI will narrow the gap between small and large publishers or actually exacerbate it, because obviously there's a lot of technology now that is available to everybody, but it seems to me, and maybe this is my own bias, that the real cutting edge scalable technology is something that still requires quite significant investment.
I guess it depends what you're looking to do with that technology and where sorry, another horrible strategy cliche, but what's your moat? What protects your business? What's differentiating you from others and keeping the barbarians away? It's an interesting one because, yes, a company like Elsevier or News Corp or John Wiley can afford very good enterprise systems. If you're Penguin Random House, you can have global deals with 11 Labs and OpenAI, and that's great. A small company can't do that. But the cost of entry here is sort of starting at about $15 per user per month to get a secure LLM. If you are minded to, there are pretty good open source tools that are available. So the technology is, I think, more evenly distributed than scale would suggest. I think where Elsevier has a real unfair advantage is probably the proprietary data that it has on hand. That's very, very hard to replicate, and that does give you a defensibility. But in other areas, if I think of my friend with the information business, the majority of the data he's dealing with is in one way or another publicly accessible. It's the combination of that data and the analysis of it that adds the particular value. And so in that case, I would say that the gap between him and larger competitors is shrinking. In your case, it's probably quite unique because of Elsevier's scale. And I wouldn't necessarily be feeling threatened if I was on your executive committee right now. If I were a small trade fiction publisher, on the other hand, where actually the moat is much, much smaller, the moat is often as small as a single book. Actually, AI is a huge leveler there, and the distance between large and small can shrink very, very quickly. So I think it's probably a different story in different parts of the industry. It's back to
Right.
what does publishing mean and how do we unpack that word?
Yeah. No, I'm fascinated by this idea that this debate is causing us to assess what it means to be a publisher, right? What is the industry actually there to do?
Yeah. And I mean, on a really simple level, what is a publisher doing? They're taking information in some form, whether for the purpose of education or enjoyment or whatever else, and they're making it available to a broad audience. And it's as simple as that.
Right.
Now, that's completely format agnostic. It doesn't matter whether it's, a database, a corpus of 700,000 articles in Simon H's case, or whether it's 30 or 40 novels in the case of a startup trade publisher.
Right.
It's the same underlying thing, but AI, I think, can help almost anyone at any point on that spectrum in some way.
Yeah. So, George, I'm conscious that not everyone listening here has spent a huge amount of time with AI or understands what it means using it as a business as opposed to using it personally. So, when you mentioned secure LLM and kind of security of IP, could you give us a sort of primer on why can't people just open up ChatGPT or a GPT derived product and go at it?
Well, it's a really interesting question. In many respects, ChatGPT is a wonderful thing because it brought down the barriers to entry. Prior to November of 2022, using an AI system required a level of technical knowledge. It wasn't accessible to the average person. ChatGPT is now a product that anyone can come to, they can put in a prompt, and they can get some kind of response. That prompt can be in their own natural language, it doesn't have to be structured in a particular way, and The system can even look past things like spelling or grammatical errors. Increasingly, we might even interact via the human voice rather than by typing something in. But the challenge with the free version of most AI platforms is the old saying in Silicon Valley: if you are not the paying customer, you are the
You're
product.
the product.
And the way that most of these companies will monetize, if you're not paying them already, is that your data that you provide is going to be used to train the next version of the model. So, for instance, it might be very convenient to you to put the entire manuscript of a book into ChatGPT to get a summary of it. That's a great time saver. But if the cost of doing that is making the entire manuscript available to the algorithm, you might not want to do that. In fact, you almost
Yes.
certainly would not want to do that. So, in most cases, if you are actually paying for the product as a paying customer, it will not share your data with other people. In fact, in some cases, it will not even train its own model on your data. And that's really the baseline level of privacy and security that publishers
Right.
should be thinking about, particularly when dealing with other people's content. That could be a manuscript, or in the marketing use case, it might be someone's personal data.
Right. So
Right.
you might want it to learn from your own content that you have fed it before, but only use that learning on your work, right? Rather
It's
than pooling everyone it's ever spoken to.
Yeah, exactly. I want to level up my own work, but I don't necessarily want to give my competitor an inadvertent leg up,
Mhm.
or the rest of the
Right.
world.
Right.
Indeed. And so, related to that, I'd like to now turn to the slightly thorny uh, intersection between
Uh-oh.
AI and copyright. Um, so, what do you have to say, or what could you tell us about the current state of AI copyright lawsuits and the evolving legal picture around AI copyright, fair use, etc.? I've got to say, on a personal level, this is something that I find endlessly confusing. So, any English translations you have would be, super welcome.
Okay, so let me start with a very quick disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer, though I've spent a lot of
Hmm.
time talking to them about this topic. It's also probably doing 30 seconds of context on how AI models learn, because this really touches it. AI models learn in three ways: structured learning, unstructured learning, and reinforcement learning. So, structured learning is the sort of thing that your colleagues at Elsevier have been doing for a long time, Simon. We can take a corpus of 700,000 journal articles, we can give that to an AI with a defined use case, and we can give it a task like understand this corpus so we can better surface advanced physics research to someone who's reading a paper. That's fine. That's very well defined. Unstructured learning is what has really underpinned a lot of recent developments in AI, such as ChatGPT. And this is the idea of taking a huge amount of data that could include your 700,000 articles, every book ever digitized, email, social media posts, pretty much every page on the open web, crawling that data and looking across it not to solve a particular task like discovery, but to solve a macro task of how is language formed? What do the probabilities of language look like? And how can we generate a plausible response based on an input from a user? Now, that clearly requires a huge amount of data for it to work. I think I'm right in saying that most recent models are more than 50 petabytes of training data.
Good grief.
And then the final part of this is reinforcement learning, that whenever we use these systems, they are constantly learning from us. They're either inferring implicit responses. Did Simon like my output based on how he's responding to it? Or actually quite explicit ones, the thumbs up or the thumbs down that they ask us to give. But the systems are constantly learning. Now, to be really clear about this as a starting point, there is absolutely no doubt that all of the major AI companies have used copyrighted data without explicit permission from the copyright holders to train their systems. To go further, it's pretty clear from the Atlantic magazine's reporting that Meta, for example, used a corpus of stolen ebooks called LibGen as part of its training data. So it was not only that they didn't ask permission from the author, but they actually went onto the web and downloaded stolen content to train on. Now, so far, that is possibly unethical, possibly immoral, according to your point of view. The billion-dollar question here is it illegal? For that, we need to actually go back to what copyright is and is not. Now, copyright is the foundation for the publishing industry. It's hugely important to all of us because it gives the author of a work the exclusive economic right to benefit from that, to license it, etc. But copyright is also limited. The notion of copyright is that it should reward the author of a work, but it should reward an author of a work because by doing so, it benefits society because new work comes through, there is creativity, and we see the upward curve of humanity. Copyright has always tried to strike that balance between the individual and society. So, for example, if we think of scientific and scholarly publishing, we accept that there are some limits to copyright. As a scholar, you don't need to get the copyright owner's permission to quote from their work for purpose of scholarship. We accept that scholarship is a good thing because it takes us forward, and that actually, if I can deny someone permission to study my work, I could actually hold back that scholarship. Similarly, from an accessibility standpoint, we accept that in many cases, if somebody buys a book legitimately but is unable to enjoy it for a particular reason, we accept the idea that they should be able to format shift it into a format that they can use. So there's always been that idea of limit. And in United States law particularly, there is the idea of fair use, which is the idea that you are using a copyright work, but you are using it to create something new, something which benefits society, and very importantly, something which doesn't damage the market for the original work. And so the argument that Meta would give you if they were on this podcast is they're not diminishing the value of your original work by training on it because they're creating something new. They would argue that they don't even care about the detail of your work. All they care about is the underlying pattern of language that it exhibits. Now, of course, not everyone accepts this. There is litigation in, I want to say, over 50 places around the world with copyright owners suing AI companies. That's going to be determined by the courts. And at the moment, we've seen this sort of go in several different directions. Earlier this spring, in a court in Delaware, Thomson Reuters, the publisher of the Westlaw legal publishing product, got an early victory when it was shown that a competitor's use of their product was not fair use. So score one for the copyright industries. Set against that, we've seen decisions in California in Anthropic versus Universal Music, where actually early claims by copyright holders were pushed back by the court. Similarly, in a New York court, OpenAI versus Raw Story Media, there was again a decision that the claims by copyright holders didn't demonstrate sufficient harm. So there's this big question of, is it fair use or not? My current bet is that we're on for many years of legal back and forth before there is any clarity on this point. I'm going to pause at that point and just ask Simon H., is that a slightly clearer picture than when we started?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's good to know what's happened so far. And again, that the situation is an evolving one and we're probably still some way away from finding a kind of long-term line in the sand on this.
Possibly, but would you like to hear what's happened with the United States? Because this is where things get really interesting. Governments around the world are seeing that AI is an enormous economic benefit potentially, and they're trying to find ways to make the most of it. In America, there is an AI action plan under development, which the government is consulting on. And I want to say 5 or 6 weeks ago, OpenAI and the other big AI companies made their submissions to that US government inquiry. And one of the points that OpenAI made is that if there is not a decision that it is fair use, it's going to hold back US AI developers, and that this is now a critical question for US competitiveness. If you don't follow Capitol Hill, US competitiveness here is code for Chinese AI developers are going to get ahead of US ones, which none of the AI companies in Silicon Valley want to see. So OpenAI has made 2 specific requests of the Trump administration. They've said, first of all, can you please deal with this as a matter of federal law rather than local law? So all of the local lawsuits are sort of pulled together and dealt with centrally.
Right.
Secondly, they've asked that the Trump administration make a determination by executive order that this is fair use, which would short circuit all of the copyright cases in the US at least. Now, just pause for a moment and think about what happens if that's the case. All the US litigation goes away, that's fine. Europe is a really interesting case because I think it's quite likely that courts there would be much less sympathetic to US AI companies and much more likely to find in a different direction. The AI companies have already shown that if there is that kind of regulatory divergence, they'll just turn Europe off. They'd rather have America be profitable and have what they want than try and comply with European safety or other regulation. And finally, where does this leave the UK? Now, I'm very interested that we're recording this podcast the day after some shape of trade deal was announced between the US and the UK. The devil, as they say, seems to be in the detail. But we still don't have clarity on what that's going to mean for tech and for digital services. That's yet to come. Given everything we know about the UK government and its current alignment with Washington, do we imagine that the current UK government would take a completely different point of view on AI to protect the copyright industries here, as important as they are, or would they be more likely to align behind an American worldview? Of course, I don't know the answer to that. I don't sit in Downing Street or on Capitol Hill, but I think there is at least a sense that there's a scenario where this gets decided quite quickly and where publishers have to react quite quickly to what a fair use world would look like. And I've been saying for about 4 months now that if a publisher isn't considering that scenario actively, they kind of ought to be.
Yeah, it's really it's an interesting look at the nature of creativity and origination, isn't it? Because if humans had perfect memory, we'd have the same problem, right? If we produce creative works, but we had perfect memory of everything we'd ever read, we'd have this. AI is as dangerous as its ability to have huge data sets instantly recollectible. So it brings up the question: what is AI creativity, as opposed to human creativity? If it's the same idea of remixing ideas into something new, that seems like an incredibly complicated philosophical problem.
God, it really is. I mean, the recombination is something that's common to both. You can take a lot of inputs, you can mix them up, you can get something new out of the far side of that. I guess the real test is the level of originality in that. AI is overwhelmingly working on what it's seen before. So, yes, of course, it can do you an avatar in the style of Studio Ghibli because it's been trained on every Ghibli illustration you've ever seen. Of course, it can write a quite highly structured derivative academic paper because it's been trained on at least 700,000 of Simon H's plus whatever else is in the data. But is it capable of something fundamentally new? Is it capable of a great leap forward, imagining a completely new genre or art form? And that's an interesting one. On the one hand, I'm tempted to say no, because I think some of those things are particularly human and tied to our experience. But at the same time, I think there's something really interesting about cross-disciplinarity. If we look at the way the academic world is structured, it's become more and more specialized. There is more knowledge in the world. You need to know more and more about a particular subject in depth before you can comment on it. If we look at 100, 200 years ago, as my friend Michael Bhaskar has in his writing, we see people making great leaps forward in science or academia. And these are generalists. You know, it was possible to have a pretty good grip of the state of the art in philosophy or science or the law or any other area. We've become a species of specialists now. We're very good at particular things. But what AI has the ability to do is to try and find the pattern across lots of different fields. AI has the ability to have something close to PhD level understanding in one field, but to be able to cross-reference it to another. What happens when, you know, we saw this huge leap forward, two of my heroes, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow and, really popularized the field of behavioral economics. They were taking two quite distinct fields, economics and psychology, and applying them together. Again, with AI, what happens if we could take 5 or 6 different disciplines and find the linkages across them? That's an enormously exciting thing. And I would like to think that what's really required there is the combination of that AI breadth plus a human researcher guiding it. But maybe AI will surprise us in what it is capable of doing.
And certainly no shortage of derivative works by human beings. So
No.
it's not...
Absolutely. So just to change tack slightly, on this podcast, as you might know, we talk a lot about accessibility. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that when we talk about AI, it's quite easy to be in kind of two camps, really. Either you think AI is going to solve all the world's problems, which I think we've established it's not, or AI is a huge threat and, must be shut down at the earliest opportunity, which I don't think any of the three of us on this call think either. And so where do you think AI can best help in the accessibility field? And is there anything that you think we need to look out for when thinking about AI in this context?
So I think about accessibility in AI, I guess, on 3 levels. First level, there's a sort of very straightforward, immediate potential for AI, which is that with EU accessibility legislation, people are thinking a lot about existing or forthcoming digital resources. Is there a robust description of an image, an alt text, for example? Is there appropriate metadata? To some extent, AI can help with that. You can just put an image in and get a description out, and it's often surprisingly good, but it absolutely needs a human in the loop reviewing that, because quite often it isn't. It also, by the way, absolutely needs context and detail. So it's not that this is a silver bullet that's going to save you all of that. But there's no doubt that it is quite a useful tool, at least for generating first drafts of data. I think where this gets more interesting is the second level, which is thinking about things like 0 to 1 uses. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is audio publishing, which I think is a really interesting area and has a lot of potential to make resources available to people, whether for accessibility or for convenience. Now, I don't know the academic side as well, but certainly in terms of trade publishing, there is a huge gap between the number of books that exist and the number of books that have been recorded as professional human voice audiobooks. That's a real problem. There simply isn't the money, the investment, the studio capacity to close that gap anytime soon. Now, AI voiced audio is not perfect by any means, but there are going to be some use cases where an AI voiced audio is better than none at all. And so that 0 to 1, I think, is really powerful. The third area of accessibility is the one where we kind of get furthest away from current practice, but this is the one that I think really interests me, which is the idea of using AI to reframe, to explain, to paraphrase. Accessibility on one level is a mechanical thing. Are you able to understand this content based on the way that it has been presented? And that's fairly simple and well understood. What if you're capable of seeing the words on a page, hearing them in your headphones, but you simply don't understand what's being said? A few weeks ago, my daughter was doing some maths homework and put a problem into ChatGPT and said, can you break this down and explain it to me stage by stage? And then when that wasn't quite right, came back a second time and said, no, could you explain this to me really simply with examples? And it broke it down in a way that made sense to her. And one of the things that large language models particularly are quite good at is taking existing data and presenting it in a new way. What if we take a textbook that's aimed at a specialist reader, but we're able to explain it in a way that a learner is able to get? What if we're able to move to a finer understanding of what content looks like for a learner? The three of us could all read the same text on the same subject, but read it at different speeds and with different levels of understanding. But at least in the confines of a printed book, we're stuck with one version of it. And that either means that we go highest common denominator and exclude people, or we go lowest common denominator and lose fidelity and detail. So I think the ability to have something that's perhaps a little bit more adaptive, a little bit more specific, that might even over time understand my particular requirements or preferences and explain it in a way that makes sense to me, I think is probably an area that we need more research and understanding of. But I think there's some really interesting potential there.
What does that look like as a product?
Well, so I was talking to a client in the US, and we were talking about the classic textbook case of chapter comprehension quizzes. You know, you read a chapter of your college economics textbook. There's 20 questions at the end of chapter 3 to make sure that you've understood it. Now, let's imagine that we do that, and Simon M gets 20 out of 20. He's doing absolutely great.
Of course.
Simon H gets 20 out of 20. He's doing great. Wonderful. George reads it and gets 9 out of 20. Now, we all then move on to chapter 4. What should the quiz look like for chapter 4? Well, actually, for both of you, because you're SWATs and head of the class, you ought to get something that's just that little bit more challenging, because what we're trying to encourage here is a flow state. We're trying to get that balance between challenge and reward, that you are both completely engaged. On the other hand, with me, if I'm running a little bit behind the two of you, what do we want to do there? Do we want to help build my confidence? Do we want to set something that's perhaps a little bit easier to build my knowledge, rather than sort of knocking me back 2 chapters in a row? Actually, you move from the idea of one static quiz that's the same for every learner into something that's genuinely adaptive. And by the way, I mean, Simon H., to preempt what you're going to say, I know that adaptive learning has been one of the big buzzwords that I think I've heard at pretty much every BET conference going back 10, 12 years or more. And we've never sort of quite hit that level yet. But I think that LLMs are probably an important technical step on a road towards something that is genuinely adaptive and unique to the learner.
I completely agree with you, and I think accessibility is about choice, right? It's about different ways of learning and how people learn best. I do want to come back to you on one thing you said a little bit earlier around accessibility and humans in the loop and validation, right? And it comes back to a challenge that I'm thinking about a lot at the moment. What when the humans aren't available? So, for example, I'm thinking about backlist content, right, where the authors aren't available. The authors might not even be alive anymore. Now, clearly, there is a situation where you can pay for other humans, but that isn't going to be scalable at the volume that most big publishers are talking here. So could you see a future where AI is validating AI, for example?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because at that point you are essentially setting a probabilistic model to check the work of a probabilistic model. We know that there are issues with hallucination, which is the first point. So for anyone who is new to this topic, hallucination is what a computer scientist calls it when you see an output that is not grounded in reality or in the training data. And we know that those levels have come down. So I've seen benchmarks that show recent models that have got something like, say, a 1% hallucination rate. Now, on the one hand, we can compare that very favourably with a lot of human beings. There are mornings when I've not had my coffee, and I can tell you I am not operating at 99% accuracy.
I've done some hallucinating.
So on the one hand, let's have that sort of sense check that, we've got to compare like with like here. However, I think there is a really specific point about scale here, that if you are operating at the scale of an imprint or list, let alone hundreds of thousands of articles, then actually a 1% error rate, even a 0.1% error rate, for heaven's sake, even 1 basis point of error measured against a corpus that size is inevitably going to lead to error. We saw such a powerful example of this last year when a book club app called Fable decided that it would be a really neat idea to generate unique end-of-year summaries for their users, summarising what they'd read over the course of the year. Sort of a little bit like your Spotify Wrapped every December. And it was great, and they were generating several tens of thousands of these. But if you're doing tens of thousands of anything and you've got a 1% error rate, you're going to have problems. And in this case, some of those summaries were deeply offensive, racist, prejudiced, and some of the users read things that really upset them. And so Fable set out with the best of intentions, but end up in the New York Times in a story about how AI goes wrong. Now, so Simon H., what this brings me back to is really sort of a question of risk tolerance. If you take human beings out of the loop, what is your risk tolerance there? If you have AI checking AI, does that change your risk tolerance fundamentally? Do the systems improve to a point where people feel comfortable with it? Now, that's a publisher versus publisher decision. I certainly know of publishers that wouldn't take that chance at all because they don't want it. And very candidly, I know people who are using AI for things like fact checking and editing use cases who are sort of rolling the dice on that one at the moment. So it is a question of individual risk tolerance, but I think scale brings a particular challenge with it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And to be clear for all those listening, this isn't something that Elsevier are considering, right? More just as someone who works in this space and who works in the content accessibility space in particular, me and lots of other people are thinking about, okay, so we have all of this content and it will be revolutionary, really would, to be able to en masse add image descriptions to all of our backlist content, but how you do that in a way that ensures quality and integrity is obviously a big question right now.
Yeah, and it comes up all the time. Sheepishly, for backlist, can we maybe just have the AI do it? Can we maybe not use our precious small numbers of staff?
So I'm going to cheat slightly because Simon Mellins and I had this conversation after an IPG event last week. And one of the things that I don't want to put words in your mouth, Simon, but I think this worries
No?
both of us, is the idea of finding the quick fix now and then circling back later to do the thorough job. And I worry a great deal about whether publishers will actually circle back later and do what they should, or whether they actually there's just a temptation to take the expedient solution, and then for no reason other than being very busy, well-meaning people, we don't then do the job thoroughly later. So I think there's a slight concern in my mind there.
Yeah, I mean, whether it gets fixed later or whether you find out later because somebody comes across something in the backlist that perhaps was a hallucination or something offensive in some way, and you find out because they've shamed you in social media somewhere.
Oh yes, and it's interesting that obviously this AI development is happening in parallel with this extraordinary thing where everyone has an ability to self-publish on social media, where brands can be taken by surprise very, very quickly, and suddenly you've got, say, a corporate communications team that isn't necessarily close to the detail of AI or workflow that's having to deal with the aftermath of something that's happened. So yeah, I mean, I think this is an area where publishers have to tread quite carefully. And I think, if I can say more broadly, I think there is an interesting challenge around brand authority in this area. We saw an example a few weeks ago of a major scientific publisher, which will remain nameless, which published a quite, I think sort of serious textbook on, I think, some aspect of oncology, I want to say. And in the very first chapter of the book, there was a paragraph that began as a large language model, and it was clear that someone had taken a ChatGPT input and had dropped it straight into the book, and neither the authors nor the editorial team nor anyone involved had spotted this until it was out in the world and was a press story. Similarly, in my newsletter last week, I wrote about the fact that researchers have found more than 700 academic journal articles that have been published that make references to LLMs or to model outputs, and it's very obvious that something's been copied and pasted from ChatGPT or a similar model into a journal article, and it's just gone out there. None of Simon's, I'm sure. But there is a serious point here, which is if we want to maintain the trust of our readers, our customers, as an industry as a whole, we kind of have to do better than this, right?
Yeah. So, George, we are talking to a pretty broad spectrum of people from the publishing industry. And I've written down this rather grandiose question, but I wonder if you'll humour me. How can publishing professionals, in the broadest sense, equip themselves to be a part of this AI world and indeed its job market, instead of feeling threatened by it, and perhaps sort of change our perspective on it? What kinds of things, apart from taking your fantastic course with the IPG?
They could all come and do my course with the IPG, which would be a very, very good idea, and
Definitely a good idea.
recommend it to anyone listening. I'm going to continue on the self-promotion theme by saying that I publish a weekly newsletter on AI, which interprets what has happened in the week in the specific context of why it matters to publishing. It's designed to be 5 minutes of your week, so go to georgewalkley.com/newsletter if you would like to keep up with that. But more broadly, and not bigging up what I do, I think there is a more serious point here, which is that AI is developing incredibly quickly, and it's developing faster than documentation can keep up with it. I've worked around technology for most of my career in publishing, and if I'm looking at a particular technology, I kind of expect to go to a website, read developer documentation, understand how it works. It's really interesting reading documentation from Anthropic or OpenAI or others. How often the engineers seem to be surprised by what their own system is doing. It's what computer scientists call a capability overhang. The idea that we don't really understand the full capability of the system until we use it, and that actually some of its capabilities are only discovered through use, not through design. Now, in that context, we are all operating in a world where we're going to learn more from experimentation than we do from documentation. I understand that there are really good principled reasons why people may not want to use AI. The copyright reason is, as I said, the original sin of AI, and that's a really important one. There are also big questions about the environmental footprint of large language models, particularly, and the training of them and the data centers that underpin those models. So that's another thing. There are concerns about DEI. There are concerns about the concentration of power in the hands of big tech companies. So there are lots of reasons why people might be cautious, and caution is absolutely fine. But if you're not using the technology every day, if all you're reading is some of the naysayers on social media, you're probably not developing a particularly good understanding of what it's good at and what it's bad at. I've never been someone who is in favor of AI for the sake of AI. It's about where is it useful pragmatically to a publisher. I think what's quite clear, for me, 2.5 years into looking at this really intensively, there are really useful, quantifiable benefits. It's not possible to say there is no role for AI in publishing anymore, because that's just a perspective that doesn't tally with experience from
Factually untrue.
from lots of people. There are also lots of problems, and we can't deny those either. But if you're not experimenting, you're not really learning. So that experimentation doesn't have to be 1,000 ChatGPT prompts every day. It doesn't have to be generating an image of yourself as a Mattel action figure to put on your LinkedIn profile. Please God that I don't see another one of those this year, because I'm really, really bored of seeing them. It doesn't mean that you have to be using a particular platform. Even if you don't want to use something from one of the big US tech companies, there's a great European large language model called Mistral, which I think is great and is well worth looking at. So there is some choice here, but I would say just use them a little bit, and the more you do use them, the more you'll understand how they're useful to you.
Yeah.
And on that note, I guess my kind of closing question for me would be, what has surprised you the most, having worked in this space for a couple of years, about either what AI can do or what it can't do?
I suppose I would really reflect on where AI is today. Now, because of what I do, I probably use AI far more than the average person, and across multiple models, depending on which client I'm working with and what they want to do. But overall, we're looking at this in May of 2025. I've got models that, on the one hand, are capable of producing PhD level literature reviews, really, sort of good quality material in many cases. I've seen people generate good workable code that solves problems. So on the one hand, there's this staggering ability to do things, but the very same models are capable of mistakes that a 16-year-old work experience person would be able to see past. So it's almost that we've got brilliantly naive models. They're capable of amazing things, but they're also capable of some quite shocking errors. So as good as they are, I still find myself looking at them. I still find myself looking at outputs very carefully. You know, in my own business, we use AI in all kinds of ways, but I wouldn't put something out that we haven't had an experienced human sign off on because it's brilliant, but I don't trust it quite yet. In fact, actually, I'm going to rephrase that very slightly. I think it was Ronald Reagan in the White House who had the slogan "Trust but verify." Yes, we're gonna use this in good faith, but we're also going to check it, and that's not a bad. It's not a bad frame for AI, I think.
Yeah, perfect. And what a perfectly fitting note to bring us to the end of our chat. I think this is one that I think we could all spin on for hours. A lot of what I learn about AI does indeed come from George's incredible newsletter. So I want to give a kind of a personal shout out to that. We are very lucky as an industry that he shares what he learns with us and shares these links and comments. So, George, if you want to just tell everybody a bit, reiterate again how they can sign up for the newsletter and other ways they can get in touch.
Absolutely. So, thank you very much. If you'd like to sign up to the newsletter, go to georgewalkley.com/newsletter. You can also find me on LinkedIn and on Blue Sky, which I'm beginning to really enjoy. There seems to be a publishing community forming there, though it's not quite what Twitter was in its glory days, but it's nice to see more and more people there. So do connect in either of those places if you'd like to.
Fantastic. Simon, any closing thoughts you want to leave with?
Only that I bet if we had this conversation in 2 years, it would be an altogether different conversation. I don't quite know how it would be different, but I feel that this is...
It's a date.
Yeah, I feel this is moving so quickly that actually our thoughts need to continue to evolve on this. So I think what I'd say to everybody out there is stay flexible.
I think that's a great way of looking at it, and I agree completely. Let's come back in 2 years and see where we've got to.
I'll see you guys there. Thanks very much. And thank you to everybody for tuning in for another episode of the Digital Publishing Podcast.